Hey everybody, how's it going? Quick review for Jeff VanderMeer's Ambergris Trilogy, or Ambergris Cycle, I think is what he calls it. And this is a series of 3 books, City of Saints and Madmen, Shriek and Afterward, and Finch. And all of these take place in this sort of fantastical city that is kind of antiquated in a lot of ways, lacking a lot of modern technology. We're not exactly sure when this takes place. And the thing that's going on in here is there are these subterranean mushroom dwellers, mushroom people that they refer to as mushroom dwellers, as well primarily as gray caps. I believe they're just gray mushroom looking people. And when we start this series, we don't really know a whole lot of what's going on. And this is one of those series where the more you read, the more everything starts to fill in. You start to get a bigger picture of what's going on in the city and the history and the interactions between the people that live there, the history of the city. It's very rich in world building, incredibly rich. I mentioned fantastical, but this is not a fantasy novel. Much like VanderMeer's Southern Reach trilogy, it's often lumped into science fiction, and I feel like a lot of science fiction readers go into it, particularly like genre readers. And it's not really like that. I think that leaves people cold. And similarly, this is not a fantasy, and I do see a lot of fantasy readers that try this out and are, well, I don't want to say lost, but don't get it, And this is weird fiction through and through. Classic horror, weird fiction. Do not be fooled, despite the first story in here. This is classic horror writing. I will do a review of VanderMeer's Southern Reach trilogy. It's a tetralogy now with Absolution, but I will do a review of that sometime. But I have to say that this is, I like this so much more. I love Annihilation, the novel, but this really blew my mind. It really got me thinking, like, oh man, I've been missing out on VanderMeer. Like, again, I really, really, really like Annihilation. It's a great novella, but the writing in here is top notch. Most of this reads as like Baroque prose, very flowery, just exceptionally well written writing. And he is such a good prose stylist. So let me dive in real quick. The first book, City of Saints and Madmen, is a collection of short stories. And I'll tell you what they're called. The first is Drayden in Love, The Hogue-Boaton Guide to the Early History of the City of Ambergris, The Cage, The Transformation of Martin Lake, and The Strange Case of X. And these stories in and of themselves have slightly different tones to them, although they all tend to be weird fiction horror with that sort of Baroque prose. My favorites were Drayden in Love, which was almost like a Edgar Allan Poe story. It kind of reminded me of this sort of like dripping gothic, I don't know, just Victorian almost kind of writing. Almost in a way like Bram Stoker. And The Hogue-Boaton Guide to the Early History of the City of Ambergris, one of my favorite short stories I've ever read. Tremendous. This is not an easy read. None of this is easy. To me, this is much more challenging to read than the Southern Reach stuff. I think that this is more dense and complex. There's a lot going on. There's many, many layers to the writing. And I think that the writing in general is just a little more mature. I think that is not just, I think his prose is better, his storytelling is better in here. I just think it's very complicated stuff that does require a lot out of the reader. This book is not always easy to read. There's some confusing stuff in here. There's a lot of information. The whole omnibus is about 900 pages. So it's certainly bigger than the Southern Reach stuff. In general, I just find it very dense, very complicated, but very readable. It's something where it's just so compelling to read. I just wanted to know more. And very much like the Southern Reach trilogy, not to go too much into that because the guy's written, of course, other great stuff. But, it's ambiguous a lot of the times. And I could get into a discussion about the ambiguity of some of his stuff. I come to expect ambiguity in horror literature and certainly in weird fiction. And it's not so much about give me the answer. It's about giving me just enough to get the picture of what's going on. I don't want to know everything. I want there to be things left up to my interpretation. I want there to be questions when I'm done reading. Of course, it needs to be done correctly. It needs to be done well, but it's done very well in here. Hogue-Boaton Guide to the Early History of the City of Ambergris. Very interesting. It's written as like a pamphlet for newcomers to the city. The city is in various states that we see it throughout the story. Sometimes it's kicking. Trade is good. Publishing companies, we have operas. Things are going great. And other times the city is terrifying and full of violence, all sorts of things like that. It's portrayed in many different ways. And the Hogbutton Guide is, like I said, a pamphlet to would-be visitors to the city. So it reads to me like a fictional history of the city right from when the first people came over and all the way up until, actually like a couple hundred years before the first story takes place. And it reads so authentically like a real history that you forget you're reading about, these sorts of Jules Verne adventures down into caves with mushroom dwelling people and things. It just reads so authentically, and it's really what hooks me about this series is just the authenticity of each style that he does. He commits to so well. I don't think he's always as successful as doing that. Sometimes when, at least in his newer stuff, let's say, I think VanderMeer, when he changes up his prose and his stylings, I just don't think it works as well. Here, this told me that, man, this guy is one of the best prose stylists in the game. This is complete with footnotes, tons and tons and tons of footnotes, stories told through the footnotes. You have an editor, you have multiple people that are arguing with each other throughout the footnotes. So this is a very that story to me is like the genesis of the second story. I think that's a very complex, wonderful story, and in addition, it just is a great story about kind of like nativism and like coming over and brutalizing a group of people, and it's a very compelling story and creepy at times. It's very creepy, and it brings up some great mysteries that will be running throughout this entire work. The second book, and this was my favorite of the whole thing, and this is one of the best books I've read in modern times. Really an astoundingly good read, a 5-star read, and that was Shriek and Afterward. And that is written by the sister. So Duncan Shriek, the guy who wrote that story in the first book. I know this is kind of heady to wrap your head around, but his sister wrote an afterword, but it's not really an afterword. It's 300 plus pages. So it actually starts to get into their family history, things that they went through growing up. It then starts to get into the history of the city. It gets into the present tense, and things that are going on that the city is not in a good state. Duncan Shriek goes missing at various points and comes back. It's a very complicated novel. I see some people that don't like this one because they find it a little boring. These are kind of drier stories. They're not like very thrilling they're not paced like super, super quickly. But to me, this was like the most complex and rewarding story in here, and by far one of my favorite things I've read recently. Pardon me, I'm just taking a sip of water. Class of 2022. I don't even know what that means. I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to get too much into it, because I think one of the joys of this is that these aren't super plot focused stories and books. So a lot of the joy is the ride that you get taken on and discovering callbacks to even earlier books, not just stories, but like Shriek has plenty of callbacks to City of Saints and Mad Men, and it's one of these things where you're just constantly putting the pieces together. But like I said, VanderMeer is always dangling the carrot in front of you, and you're always like just waiting for the next shoe to drop. You're always like wondering, I wonder about this, and I think it's done just to so much more success in this omnibus rather than the Southern Reach. But Shriek is just so good, and there's some terrifying scenes in it. It gets really scary at times. It's deep, it's sad, it's beautifully written, and it has a lot of characters from the first book that have these little in-universe characters. And as a matter of fact, the entire thing opens with a pull quote from a fictional character. Then we get to Finch, which is quite unique. It's a very big departure. This one I like the least, though I still really enjoyed it. Finch is written like a noir. It's a detective novel with this character Finch, and it takes place quite a bit of time after the second book. And there's a murder a human is murdered and a gray cap is murdered, and it's up to Finch to basically figure out what's going on. And it's hard-boiled detective story in a noir style. It has that short, snappy prose. So it is stylistically a huge departure from the other two books, though it's still very grounded in Ambergris. And that's why I really enjoyed that story. Was it was very creative of VanderMeer to tell the story in such a vastly different way than the other two stories, but still keep it in what makes Ambergris great and what you've come to know and learn about how all of this operates. In addition, it's very freaky. It gets very hallucinogenic. So think of like a hard-boiled detective story, a noir that has a horrifying hallucinogenic drug-fueled quality to it. It's the best way I could describe it. I think the reason I like this one the least, just because I love noir, I love hard-boiled detective novels. I think VanderMeer's prose in this one, while he does do, he's a very well researched author, like he does style it quite well. I just have read so much noir that it doesn't quite hit the heights of some of those, And this is, of course, it's a very unique noir. But in terms of his prose, like it reads like James Ellroy or something like that. That really fast staccato like prose, and Ellroy is just a master at that. So that's the only reason. I also think it maybe got away from things a little bit in terms of maybe even explaining a little too much, though you're still left with answers. You're never going to come out of a weird fiction work, with a total, there's not going to be any, villain explaining his grand master plan in these kinds of books. So anyways, I don't want to say too much more. It's very, very unique. I really, really, really enjoyed this. It was such a great reading experience. And I think this is underrated. Like, I don't see people talk about this series as much. I wish I knew her name. There's another reviewer on YouTube who has a video that if you are intrigued or, you read this and like it, check her video out too. She goes much more in depth than I do. And I think it explains very well why this is